Hello everyone and welcome to the Village Halls podcast sponsored by Allied Westminster, the UK's largest specialist provider of village hall insurance and the home of Village Guard. Now, when we launched our podcast in January of this year, I must admit I wasn't really expecting to hear about a charismatic Japanese prisoner of war leading a village hall revolt or someone dressed up as a sugar cube falling off a stage. But every couple of weeks or so, our guests have either surprised us, enlightened us, or inspired us in one way or another. So for this, our final episode of the year, I thought we might take a look back at some of the highlights of season 1 of the Village Halls podcast, reliving a few of those special moments, while taking the opportunity to thank our terrific guests who've come on the show and shared their helpful knowledge and their fascinating stories. So let's start at the very beginning with a wonderful guest who is very well known in the world of community buildings, Lisa Beaton, and who really helped get our podcast rolling with some fascinating insight into the history of village halls.
It was the 19th century when Victorian philanthropists began to realise the need for a meeting place, and there were some magnificent halls built in the 19th century. At the same time, there was the creation of reading rooms and small chapel rooms. They tended to be very small facilities. So there was the beginnings of a sort of movement towards village halls towards the end of the 19th century. But it was really the First World War that was the impetus for the building of village halls. Lots of reasons for that. One was the awareness that many villages had lost a whole generation of young men, and their desire to provide a memorial in the form of a building, a war memorial hall. There was the drive to improve social and educational provision in rural areas. The development of the WIs were part of that, and they had nowhere to meet. There were returning servicemen who needed to get together. I mean, we now know about post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah,
that was
absolutely.
a serious issue that was sort of understood in its own way. And then there was actually the availability of old army and RAF huts, hospital huts, and many village halls were originally that kind of hut. And what happened was that in the early 1920s, the newly formed National Council for Social Service set up initially a Village Clubs Association, which quickly became a Village Halls Department. And that was helped by grants from the Carnegie UK Trust and the Development Commission, which put forward a loan fund. And from then on, there was finance available to help with the building of village halls. So the 20s and 30s was the heyday. And in the mid-1930s, that's when the powers were provided to local authorities to start providing grants for the building of community recreational facilities. So obviously, in the Second World War, there was a pause in the building of village halls, and right through until 1955, there were not the building materials available.
Wow, I mean, you mentioned the Second World War there, and I guess even though, as you say, the kind of building was paused, I guess the village halls themselves must have played a significant role. I'm showing my age here and thinking back to the good old Dad's army, and I remember the National Guard, as it was, that was a church hall or a village hall that it was actually set in. And I guess that's just an example, isn't it, of the kind of facility that the village halls provide at moments of real national need.
Absolutely. I mean, they were used for jam making by the WI, sort of knitting garments for soldiers. But importantly, obviously, as a source of entertainment when people really needed entertainment. And some played a different part in the war effort. There's a record in a book by Gordon Welchman about the Enigma files of village halls in the Letchworth area of Hertfordshire being used as electrical sub-assembly factories.
Wow, yeah. So you can almost say that the village halls contributed to the winning of the war as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Of course, History is not just about the distant past. Many village halls have been making history in the present too. And one remarkable contribution in these challenging times has been with the COVID vaccination programme. Let's hear a snippet from episode 3 back in February when Teresa Killeen told us about how Ticehurst Village Hall and her incredible group of volunteers did a magnificent job of helping a local pharmacist give life-protecting jabs to thousands of elderly and vulnerable people in their community.
Well, it must have been about December when Hardik Desai, who is our fantastic young pharmacist in the village, started to think about whether, well, he'd been contacted by NHS and the pharmacy group, and they had asked if he would like to put forward a bid to vaccinate. He realised his shop, his pharmacy premises were too small. And I happened to be in there one day, and he was saying, if I could get a contract to do this, would community friends help me? So I said, yes, I'm sure I could get volunteers, no problem. But then we realised that actually, no matter how we thought about it, his shop was not going to work. We looked at the church, that wasn't going to be suitable either. But then, we have the perfect building. We've got an amazing village hall with 2 very large rooms, a room that we can lock. We can actually put a one-way system through it, and that was very important for NHS England. So we could have an entrance, 2 rooms with vaccination, and then come through to another very large room where they could sit post-vaccination and go out of the back door, so that there was no cross-contamination, and we could maintain social distancing throughout. So we had a look round. He thought it was a good idea. We contacted the guy who was the chair of the Beatrice Drew Trust. So that's the trust that runs the village hall. And Peter came along, also thought it was a great idea because, of course, at this moment in time and for quite a long time, he hasn't had any income into the hall because, of COVID. So it sort of was almost a no-brainer and a win for everybody because it meant that Peter could keep the hall up and running, and he had people in there daily. I mean, I have been amazed at the number of volunteers. Ticehurst Community Friends would on average have had about 30, 35 active volunteers taking people to hospital appointments and dentists and the like before COVID. Mm-hmm. I now have 162 volunteers. And every time I say the number the following day, I have to add a few more. Yeah. I mean, it's just absolutely phenomenal, the response. And people keep constantly saying, are you sure you don't want me to do something else? Can I do something else? And the fact we're only doing it 3 days or 2 days, actually, I think the volunteers are quite frustrated because they'd like to be doing more. But maybe in time we will. If we're doing first and second vaccinations at the same time, we will be very busy.
Well, wonderful. So, thank you so much, Teresa. Not only for talking to me today, but for being part of what is undoubtedly an historic moment. And I know that may sound a little over the top to some, but the fact is there's never been a vaccination programme like this ever undertaken before. And so no doubt it will be something that will be talked about for many, many years to come.
Yes, I think my grandchildren, it will be part of their history.
Remarkable stuff. And just one example, of course, of the incredible work village halls have been doing and still are, of course, to support the UK's vaccination programme. Now, food, as well as COVID, of course, has been a bit of a recurring theme on our show throughout this year. And it was lovely to hear from Hermione Lamond back in March about how she'd managed to keep the tiny village of Algeo on the Isle of Skye going with vital supplies throughout lockdown. Not only did her plan keep a village hall-based shop going, but the locals liked the idea so much, it's carried on, even after the lifting of restrictions.
I did honestly think that come July, August time, when all our restrictions sort of lifted a bit last year, that things would tail off and people would go back to their old ways and do what they were doing before, but it's just continued. And we've got a steady number of orders every single week right the way through. And it's just so good to get the support from a local community like that to stand up and support their shop in that sense. It's overwhelming, actually. It's just been so good. And in supporting me, they're also supporting the hall, because I have to pay rent to the hall. So the hall's continued to have a bit of income. So it all goes round and round. It's good.
Yeah, and I mean, it flows further afield, doesn't it? Because I guess it's also helping those suppliers to you. In wherever they are, they're keeping going as well. So it's a win-win-win, isn't it?
Oh, it is. Yeah, it's just worked so well. And I know I'm not the only one who's doing this. I think there's lots of this going on across the country, and I think it's going to be a very positive thing for local shopping. I'm not talking about the big high street thing that's obviously in a major turmoil, but the local produce and keeping your families fed. This is a good way to do it.
Brilliant. Well, wonderful. Thanks for telling us your story, Hermione. I think, there's an important message in there, and it's just around simply finding a way to carry on, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, as I say, there was that sort of initial, oh my goodness, where are we going to go from here? And then a very simple solution was staring me in the face, and off we went. And it's been one of the best things ever.
Yeah, and I mean, there's no more basic need than food as well, of course. And you've been able to keep on supplying the local community. And we
have lots of treats in there.
Yeah. I was going to say, what could be more important? And I hope there's some good whiskey being added to a few of those boxes every now and then as well, too. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely cake.
Definitely cake. Yeah, we'll sidestep the whiskey. Yeah.
Yeah.
A delightful episode, that one, and well worth listening to in full, as was episode 22 of Series 1, which I would like to thank Nadia Lindsay for. Nadia came on and told us all about Incredible Edible, a village planting initiative with all kinds of community benefits. It's something I'm sure many village halls could try out themselves, so give that one a listen too if you haven't already. Now, talking of food, perhaps one of our strangest episodes of the year was when I was joined by stress and wellbeing expert Dave Algeo, who warned us all about the dangers of becoming overwhelmed. Dave uses an interesting vegetable analogy to get his key messages across, so let's have a listen to some of what he said.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing. That's where overload, dealing with the underlying overload, we tend not to go off at the small stuff, the sprout-sized stuff. If we're on a good day and we've got nothing else, we haven't got a lot on our plate, we tend to be quite calm, composed, and well able to handle that. It's when we're carrying lots of cabbages. So, as you say, avoidance is not the answer. It's about confronting the cabbages. What are you can grab a pen and paper, jot them down. What are the demands I've got? Give yourself credit for carrying a lot of them, and then pick the smelliest one, the one you least want to deal with, and slice and dice and chunk it into sprout-sized chunks. Because your brain under stress works better with sprouts. It can sweat sprouts. It doesn't want to deal with cabbages. So by chunking it down, what I mean is probably what many of you do, which is you kind of say, right, well, what do I need to do? What are the actions and the tasks? You might create a to-do list. Something practical that can make you go, right, I need to do that first and that second, or I need to ask such and such for a bit of help. But by confronting the cabbage and breaking it down, we make it more manageable for us, and we can then start to feel more in control and like we're coping, and actually probably look at the pile of cabbages and go, actually, that one's not my problem. Why am I taking that cabbage on? That's somebody else's. Because how many of us are very good at taking on other people's problems or challenges? Leave it with me, I'll sort that out. When actually it's their cabbage to sort out,
Well, there you go. I told you it was a strange one, but trust me, when it's all put into context and when you hear everything Dave has to say in episode 19, it really does make a lot of sense and can actually be helpful. On the subject of health and well-being, perhaps one of my favourite episodes of the year was when I was joined by Sian Highnam for episode 7 of our podcast. Sian has worked tirelessly to get a cut flower garden up and running at Fontmell Magna in North Dorset, and the garden has helped create a partnership between the village hall and the doctor's surgery there, all to do with something called social prescribing, which, to be honest, I hadn't heard of until I spoke to Sian, and which I'm now a big, big fan of.
I'm no doctor, I must say that, but social prescribing it's just something I think which is just so inspirational. And if you don't mind, I've taken the liberty of actually going on the NHS site, and I have actually got their definition here because I think it needs to be explained completely accurately. So the NHS site actually describes social prescribing as a way for local agencies to refer people to a link worker who can then give those people their time and focusing on what matters to them. And they can then take a holistic approach to someone's health and well-being. So it can work for a whole range of people, maybe people with one or more long-term conditions, maybe someone who needs support with mental health, and maybe someone who's lonely or isolated. So, for example, our wonderful local practice, they gave us some statistics that, over 40% of patients might attend the surgery 2 or 3 times a week with nothing physically wrong.
Yeah.
And they may be the prime people that would fall into this category who would really benefit from a holistic approach and doing something different rather than just taking a pill.
Yeah.
So very powerful, actually.
Yeah, so this is like a lifestyle sort of thing. Making yourself feel better, not just, as you say, popping a pill and hoping that whatever you've got goes away. but yeah, doing something that's lifestyle or that brings you into contact with other people and so on. And just as a consequence of that, improves your health and improves your well-being overall. And I guess what better place to do that than outdoors in the fresh air and doing something with nature as well. And I guess that's, you're having a garden connected to the village hall, it's also connected to the surgery. It's just the perfect combination, isn't it? It
absolutely is. And the cut flower, I think a cut flower garden in essence is even more related to that whole drive, because in a cut flower garden you get a packet of seeds, so the seeds have been distributed to 25 growers. You have nothing, it's in the soil, you nurture them, you watch them grow, you plant out together socially. We'll then have the blooms that we cut together again socially, and we can share those flowers with other people. So I just think by the nature of a cut flower garden, nurturing, growing, blooming, that's what one would hope to achieve with social prescribing itself, really. Certainly any village halls, I would suggest that they contact their health partnerships and get in contact with their social prescribing lead. And it may very well be, it doesn't have to be a garden, it could be a befriending morning that they have, where the surgery suggests that patients go to a village hall, once a week for tea and coffee, that kind of thing. So it could be something as simple as a befriending service. It could be a new club, inviting people to come to certain clubs. Walking clubs are very popular with social prescribers, music clubs, Pilates, dancing. So it could very well be that they've got things going on already in their village halls, exercise classes, etc., that could be directly relevant to a social prescriber.
If you'd like to know more about social prescribing and how village halls can play a role in supporting community health and well-being, please give the episode a listen. Now, sharing ideas between different halls has become a big goal here at the Village Halls podcast. It's all part of building what we call our listening community. So I was delighted to hear once again from Fiona Sinnott, who had been a guest on the show in September and who emailed me recently to say that after telling us in episode 17 about a fundraising calendar they'd produced at Bennington Village Hall in Hertfordshire, she'd been contacted by another hall over 500 miles away who wanted some advice on doing the same. Just the kind of thing we like to hear. And of course, sharing and hearing about good practice is something that's always useful to village halls. So I was really pleased to welcome Shirley Maginley from the NSPCC onto our show in June, who covered the issue of safeguarding.
If your role involves working with children and young people, then most certainly you will be eligible for a DBS check, and it's good practice. It's relatively cheap, about £23 really. But anyone could apply for a basic level check, and it will only reveal a certain amount of information. But if your role requires a higher level check, you will need to make sure that you check this out to make sure you got the proper level check that you need. And it'll be your responsibility to ensure that you have this level check. So absolutely, most likely if someone comes to a village hall and they run in an activity for children, it probably wouldn't be the first time. It's probably something they do maybe frequently or from every now and then, but they will have experience in it. And it's always a good idea to make sure that they know what their responsibilities are, to have these checks, to know what safe practice entails, to ensure that they work safely with children, and to know as well if any concerns that they become aware of or told, that they know who to speak to, just to have a chat about it and to refer it upwards.
Because of course, I mean, this is everyone's nightmare situation, isn't it? But what should you do if you discover that someone who could pose a risk is actually working with children?
Yes. And sometimes, we don't, I should say most of people who work with children, the far majority, want to do their best to ensure that children are safe and they're responsible. But we do know that there are individuals who will seek out ways to harm children in some sort of way. So if anyone becomes, aware of an individual who they think may have harmed a child or behaved in a way that may not be suitable for them to be working with children, they should certainly raise that, that concern. Hopefully, village halls will have policies, safeguarding policies and procedures in place, and a named person to go to discuss these concerns. And anyone using, any group using a village hall should be aware of this. They should be aware of what the safeguarding policy is for that village hall or community hall. So if you do have concerns about anyone in it, again, you don't have to have all the facts because, it would not be possible sometimes to have that. But if you have a nagging concern or just something that doesn't sit quietly with you, please do share your concern with someone who can take it forward.
As well as a big thank you to Shirley, I'd also like to mention Will Molland of rebuildcostassessment.com, who highlighted the little-known issue of underinsurance back in August, Amy Chambers of Leicestershire and Rutland RCC, who covered loneliness and isolation in episode 10, Bernard Hammock of Hallmaster, who spoke about digital transformation, and George Courtice, of course, who explained how 75 village halls in Northumberland have all been working together as part of a wider consortium. Many thanks to all of you for taking the time to share your knowledge and insight. I'm very happy to say that as well as all the important, serious stuff, we've also had a few laughs on the show this year. A standout moment for me was when world-renowned health and safety author and expert Teresa Budworth, who also does a bit of amateur dramatics in her spare time, joined me on the show to offer some safety advice to halls and ended up telling me this little story.
This was in my previous drama group, actually. It was a few years ago. I mean, one of the things about village halls and their stages is often they're quite small. So what drama groups and performance groups tend to do is to build out the front of the apron using blocks. So we were in a village hall which was not our home one, and it had a curved apron in front of it. So when we put our blocks in front of it, they left wedge-shaped gaps. So it was a comedy sketch show, and at the time I was dressed as a sugar cube, which meant I was wearing a large white box with just my head poking out the top and my legs poking out the bottom. And that the premise of the sketch was that it all went horribly wrong and I had to kind of back off stage looking very embarrassed, except that I accidentally stepped into one of the wedge-shaped holes and basically I disappeared down the hole and the sugar cube stayed on stage. So slightly painful, but I think it was very funny for the audience.
Hats off to Teresa for admitting to that one. And it just shows we can all get it a bit wrong sometimes. And Teresa's wasn't the only story we heard in 2021. It was wonderful to hear from so many people connected to their village halls, telling us about their history and some of the fascinating characters who'd played a part in bringing their communities together. Let's hear a short snippet from Alan Rowe, who painted a dramatic picture of an all-out revolution and the emergence of a charismatic new leader for the hall in his village of Bobbin Hall back in the 1980s.
And we had at the time a sitting tenant there, and it was deemed that the conditions of the hall were such that it was not suitable for anyone to live there. So the committee at that time had to scramble quite hard to find new accommodation for the tenant, and then on that basis were permitted through a mini improvement programme to keep the hall open for social purposes for a few years, from 1977 through to 1983 or 84, but it was still in a pretty poor condition.
And then what happened next?
Well, what happened next was that the committee that had manfully looked after the hall for that length of time met up with other people at a New Year's Eve party, in fact, in December 1985, and it was sort of decided very informally at 2:00 in the morning on the basis of a certain number of drinks that we needed some new faces, and there was a very sort of distinguished character turned up on the scene at that time, a Major Alan Gibson, who was at the party, and he constituted sort of informally during the party a new committee which met more formally on the 3rd of January 1986, at which I became the treasurer of the village hall, and Major Gibson became the chairperson, and we were asked under his formidable leadership to not only create a new committee but commit ourselves to building a brand new village hall. And we all agreed to do that because we were sitting in a freezing building on the 3rd of January in 1986, and we thought it was best to agree with him rather than disagree and get the meeting over with as quickly as we possibly could.
So the Major performed a bit of a coup as far as the committee was concerned, and then became the leader. And I understand he was quite a character, Alan, yeah?
Yes, Alan Gibson was a very distinguished man. He, as a young man, he'd joined the army. He had trained to what he thought was going to be warfare in Scandinavia, so he learned to ski and that sort of thing, but then very quickly got posted to Burma. And unfortunately, after just a few months, was imprisoned by the Japanese and was in one of the Burma railway camps, which, as you know, were pretty dreadful places. He suffered a loss of most of his senior colleagues in that camp, was there for some 2 to 3 or 4 years, I'm not quite sure how long. Went down from being a 12-stone formidable rugby player to being a 6-stone person who was just about surviving. And the camp was relieved eventually by the Black Watch. And on the day this happened, Alan told me that he thought he'd died because he heard bagpipes. He couldn't believe bagpipes in Burma, but it was indeed the Black Watch. And he was charged by them as the surviving most senior officer to accept the surrender of the Japanese camp commander, symbolized by the handing over of a samurai sword, which he retained. So he returned to the UK, took up a job which eventually became production director of one of the UK's leading pottery companies, and did that for many years, and moved to Bubbenhall in retirement, which was good for us because he became then the leading force, moving from the old reading room to a new village hall, which we managed to build and open at the end of 1986.
To be honest, I could have chatted with Alan all day. And other great storytellers we've had on the show this year include Steve Barnes from Down Village Hall, Jane Crofts from Wellow Church Schoolroom, Peter Power from Emery Down, and the eloquent Sue Lewis from Aberporth Village Hall. Good luck with the ongoing rebuilding project, Sue, and best wishes to all of you out there, like Sue, Peter, Jane and Steve, who do so much to support your local village, church and community halls. You're all simply amazing. And last but by no means least, let me thank Joe Rogers, who enlightened us all about the many village halls that were once tithe barns, and Pam Rhodes, of course, of Songs of Praise fame, who in episode 14 talked about her media career and a recent series of novels based around a fictitious and at times quite scandalous community hall. If you're stuck for what to give your favourite village hall friend for Christmas, look up Hope Hall on Amazon or any other good bookstore. Oh, and big thanks to Simon Bland, who spoke about the challenges of COVID in episode 2. Simon is not only chair of his local village hall, but does a lot to help many different rural communities and has been a fantastic supporter and advocate of our show behind the scenes this year. Many, many thanks, Simon. And thanks, as always, to our headline sponsor and specialist insurance provider, Allied Westminster, for making our podcast possible, and whose services you can discover more about at villageguard.com, and to online booking system provider Hallmaster, who also sponsor our podcast and can be found at hallmaster.co.uk. And so that's it for season 1 and 2021 for the Village Halls podcast. I really hope you've enjoyed our shows this year, and leaving the very best until last, of course, my final big thank you is to you. Thanks for tuning in and being part of our listening community. You've already put our podcast in the top 10% listened to in the world, so what can I say other than cheers and have a fantastic Christmas, everyone. Let's hope it all goes well and a happy new year to you all. Thanks again for listening to the Village Halls podcast, a unique listening community for Britain's village, church and community halls, and anyone interested in the vital community services they provide. We'll be back again soon with a brand new series in the new year, so if you haven't already, please visit thevillagehallspodcast.com to subscribe, sign up for updates, link through to our social media pages, and to find out more. Until the next time, goodbye for now.